Day 3 of testimony in the preliminary exam of John Skelton gave the judge more idea of his movements on November 26, 2010. That's the day Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner Skelton disappeared. The first witness of today was Kelsey Borowski. Her former stepfather is John Skelton's cousin. She testified that about 1 p.m. that day, a call came into her parents' house asking for someone to take John to the emergency room. She had just graduated from high school. One of her parents couldn't do it, and the other one just said they didn't want to. And I would be pretty upset if I were her all these years later, having to testify in this preliminary exam and potentially a murder trial when your parents should have taken him to the hospital. You were just a teenager. Anyway, Kelsey goes over to John's house on Congress Street, and she said she found him leaning on the dining room table heavily with an injured ankle. She said he had a manila envelope and cigarettes in his hand, and he was pretty injured. On cross-examination, she said John was wearing a robe, pajama pants, and slippers. She testified that John asked her to get a bag, and she helped him to the car, and he told her he wanted to go to the Fulton County Health Center in Wauseon. Now, during this drive, Borowski says that John was frantically texting and was on the phone with someone that she perceived to be Tanya, and she said that the boys were not going to be back in time for the custody trade-off. She also testified that this was an intense situation, and after the call, John said, "I lost my boys, I lost my kids," and then said something about the children being at a friend's house. She said she got the impression that the person on the other end of the call was Tanya, but she didn't know for certain. And she also testified that she asked John how he injured himself, but he brushed it off, and she said she really didn't care anyway. The next witness is John's aunt, Lisa Kern. She testified that earlier that same morning, again, the day after Thanksgiving, that around 6:30 or 7 in the morning, John came to her door and basically unloaded a box of stuff, including a camcorder and a USB drive. She said that John told her to hold on to the items and not give them to anybody without a warrant. She said that that John didn't explain why. She invited him in for a cup of coffee, and he said, "No, I can't. The boys are in the van." She said, "Bring them in." He said, "They're sleeping." The van was parked by the road, so she never laid eyes on the boys. She said she kept the camcorder and USB drive and never looked at what was on them. The following day, her sister-in-law came over and asked whether Kern had seen the boys. And when Kern learned they were missing, she mentioned to her sister-in-law about this camcorder and USB drive, and her sister-in-law said, "We need to take this to the police." On cross-examination, the defense really focused heavily on Lisa Kern's observations of John's relationships with his son. And pretty much the defense is doing this with all the witnesses. On cross-examination, they're really just saying, "But did you ever see John abuse his kids?" And everybody says no. And then the defense says, "Did John have a good relationship with his kids? Was he a good father?" And they say yes. So these first two accounts really show where John was on Black Friday. He went to the hospital that afternoon. He had been seen that morning with the camcorder and the USB drive, saying the boys were asleep in the van, but no one actually laid eyes on them. Another major part of day 3 of the preliminary exam for John Skelton was the duffel bag that was found outside of a relative's home and the searches that followed for the boys who were now missing. I'm Melissa Andrews, a crime and investigative reporter and anchor covering the preliminary exam of John Skelton in Lenawee County, Michigan. Skelton served 15 years for causing the disappearance of his 3 sons in 2010. They have never been found, and he is now charged with their murders. So this is day 3, and a woman named Renee O'Brien testified that on Black Friday, which is the day that the boys were discovered missing, that she was staying at her boyfriend at the time's house named Brian O'Brien. So she was leaving for work. She worked in healthcare, and she tripped over this duffel bag on the porch of his home. And she said she woke him up to ask about this duffel bag, and he said that her brother was going to come stay. And she was like, no, he's not. But she said that she never opened the bag or touched the bag. So her now husband, Brian O'Brien, took the stand. He is John's cousin, and said that Renee woke him up and he believed that the items belonged to the Skelton boys. There were 3 coats and 3 toothbrushes. His mother, Charlene, testified that she called police about the bag, and Brian said that eventually they gave this bag to the police. Now, it was not clear during his testimony how much time had elapsed between when Renee and he discovered the bag, when John may have left the bag, and when it was given to police, because it was later in the afternoon on the 26th that the boys were declared missing. I think the first police showed up at like 4:30 in the afternoon. Renee is saying that this bag was found between 2:30 and 3 in the morning. So you give it even a little bit after then, to where family probably didn't even know for a couple more hours. So we don't know exactly what the timeline was, how many hours between when the bag was found and when they gave it over to police. So Brian, his testimony is important because he obviously is related to John. He and his mother own nearly 5 acres on 2 parcels with a lot of wooded property, and he described river bottoms that run for miles. So after Andrew, Tanner, and Alexander were reported missing, Brian said that he did join several searches that stretched for miles for these boys. He described searching river bottoms near his home and areas around State Line Farms, which he described as a large farm. He also said the searches extended into Pioneer, Ohio, essentially going from Morenci to Pioneer, covering areas in Michigan and Ohio. He said at times there were 30 to 50 people searching. They searched for days and they never found a clue. So Brian said in December of 2010, he went to visit John in jail. He acknowledged on cross-examination that investigators did coordinate this visit and urge him to make this visit to try to get information about where the boys were. And when the defense asked him whether he was working for the police, he said, no, I was working for the boys. So Brian testified during this jail conversation that John told him he did give the boys away, but did not remember to whom. So this is multiple accounts of different things that John has now said from different people. According to Brian, John did not explain why he gave them away. And the defense also questioned Brian about his perspective going into this visit. And he acknowledged that his family also wanted him to try to get information out of John about the boys because they believed that John killed the boys because John was the last person with the boys. But the defense again asks, was John a good dad? Did John love the boys? And Brian said yes. So this portion of the testimony really covers the appearance of this mysterious duffel bag, the immediate search for Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner, and again, the family's attempts to get John to tell them where the boys are. Some of the most significant testimony on day 3 came from one of John Skelton's relatives, an aunt by marriage, who talks about a conversation that she had with John in her home about a week before the boys disappeared around Thanksgiving of 2010. I'm Melissa Andrews, a crime and investigative anchor and reporter covering the preliminary exam of John Skelton, who is accused of murdering his 3 boys, Alexander, Andrew, and Tanner, in 2010. So Charlene O'Brien tells us that she is John's aunt by marriage. She said that about a week before Thanksgiving in 2010, John came to her house and sat at her dining room table and started talking about problems with Tanya. According to Charlene, John was rambling and angry, and she testified that John said that he was messing with the kids, but she said that she did not believe that. Now, some people have asked why Tanya's prior sex offense continues to come up. Tanya had to testify the other day that she had sexual relations with a 14-year-old, and she was designated a sex offender, and she served time in prison for this. Now, the reason we have to talk about this, and knowing Tanya, I know that she knows that it needs to be discussed, is because this was used as somewhat of a motive or an excuse that John gave for giving these boys away, which investigators don't believe happened. So that is the reason that this needs to be discussed in court. And in this situation, John's aunt is saying that John is claiming that Tanya may be messing with the kids in that way, but she says she did not believe that, and she trusted Tanya with children. She had family members that this had also happened to, a sex offense, and she trusted Tanya. So according to her testimony, John said he was going to take matters into his own hands because Charlene had advised him, well, if you really do think that Tanya's doing something to your boys, why wouldn't you go to the police? They'll help you. And he said, no, they won't. I'm going to take matters into my own hands. She told him not to do that, and she said that John left the home angry and they did not hear from him again. She said after the boys disappeared, the police chief called to ask whether the boys were at her house because they had come over previously to play, and she testified about two pieces of property that she turned over to investigators. One was the duffel bag that her son, Brian O'Brien, found on his porch. She said she called police about it and thought she recognized that the coats may be the boys, but she wasn't for certain. The other involved a camcorder and USB drive that John had given to her sister-in-law, Lisa Kern. Charlene also said that she had contacted police about those items, and she took those to investigators. And then she also testified about something that John allegedly said after he was in jail. She said that John said that he would tell family members where the boys were if they came to visit him in jail. Again, on cross-examination, the defense wants to talk about how John had a great relationship with his kids. So I think here it's important that Charlene described this conversation right before Thanksgiving and the week leading up to it as John raging about Tanya, and she characterized his behavior as childish. The judge today also heard some timeline evidence about custody and when that was established after John returned from Florida with the children, and that Tanya had an order that the kids remain in Michigan and attend the Morenci schools. There was another witness that I want to bring up to you as well, because I think this is important to the timeline. Chris Hawker, her uncle lived next door to John on Congress Street, and she said she was over there on Thanksgiving. They were having dinner there, and she looked out the window and she saw two boys who her uncle said were Alexander and Andrew, and they were playing on this wooden structure. And she noticed it because she thought it was unsafe. She remembered that it had been raining earlier and it was cold outside, and the boys were only wearing hooded sweatshirts without jackets. So we're getting a lot of timeline information. We know from Chris Hawker that those boys were alive on Thanksgiving afternoon. Tanya had also testified that she spoke to the boys in the morning on Thanksgiving, or she spoke to John in the morning on Thanksgiving, and she heard the boys in the background, but she did not hear them in a later call that day. And we also know that according to his relatives, John was giving USB and electronics to his aunt in the very early morning hours of Black Friday.